Hello and welcome to the program. The U.S. has summoned the Russian ambassador to express concern about a collision between Russian fighter jets and an American drone over the Black Sea. Washington has accused Moscow of irresponsible behavior and said the drone was involved in a routine operation in international airspace. Russia denied the U.S. claims, instead saying the drone crashed after it lost altitude while maneuvering sharply. This was the Pentagon spokesman a little earlier.
At approximately 7:03 a.m. Central European Time, one of the Russian Su-27 aircraft struck the propeller of the MQ-9, causing U.S. forces to have to bring the MQ-9 down in international waters. Several times before the collision, the Su-27s dumped fuel on and flew in front of the MQ-9 in a reckless and unprofessional manner. This incident demonstrates a lack of competence in addition to being unsafe and unprofessional.
Well, we can hear now from our Washington correspondent, Gary O'Donoghue, who's been following this story for us and explained the picture so far.
Russian fighters came into contact with an American unmanned surveillance aircraft over what the Americans say was international waters in the Black Sea. Now, these drones, as they're sometimes called, conduct effectively spying missions, but Americans insist it was over international water. Now, what seems to have happened is that one of these Russian planes collided or struck the drone, damaging its propeller, and the Americans had to then bring their aircraft down into the sea. Now, we've been learning some fascinating detail in the last few minutes. It seems that this encounter between these two Su-27, these pretty old Russian planes, and this drone went on for about 30 or 40 minutes. And the Americans said that they flew in front of the drone, that they apparently dumped fuel on top of it as well, presumably to try and sort of disorient the drone, etc., before this collision took place and the drone had to be brought down. Now, as far as we know, or the Pentagon is saying at the moment, there's been no contact with Russia's military on this. We do know that the State Department here in Washington have summoned the ambassador Anatoly Antonov to an audience. That's a pretty stiff diplomatic measure. It might not sound like much, but that's what happens when countries have serious diplomatic problems with one another. And we're learning more details. We're also promised by the Pentagon perhaps some imagery of what happened in this collision over the Black Sea. They said they're going through the process of declassification, so we may get some stills, we may get some video of what actually happened later on.
That was Gary O'Donoghue reporting on that story for us. Well, earlier I spoke with Professor Matthew Schmidt, who's from the University of New Haven, and he told me that he's convinced that this collision was deliberate.
Oh, absolutely. The Pentagon is engaging in, diplo speak here, but it's clear that if you're flying in front of the drone, slowing down to match speed, dumping fuel on it, that this is a deliberate attempt to bring down the drone. Absolutely.
Well, the Russian ambassador has now been called in by the U.S., as my colleague Gary O'Donoghue was just reporting there. How much of an escalation is this episode?
The Pentagon announced with this that this isn't the first time that they've had these kinds of incidents, but this seems to be the worst. The first time they've really the Russians have attempted to bring the drone all the way down instead of just harassing it. So I think it is a serious escalation at this point. Calling in the ambassador is a sign of that. I don't think you'll see these drones flying solo anymore. They'll have manned escorts with them.
And what is the significance of that? What does it mean in terms of operations going forward for the U.S. as it tries to evaluate its response here?
If you put manned escorts next to these drones, it's a warning, right? It says if you're going to come near the drone, then you're going to have to risk engaging with American pilots. So it's escalating into that point of having two manned aircraft pairing off against each other. It's worth noting too that these drones are amazing pieces of intelligence equipment. They can forward look with their sensors almost over the entire peninsula of Crimea. So, the Russians have a serious stake here in stopping these drones from flying in international waters.
And in terms of surveillance operations going forward, as you point out, vital information in these drones, what, if anything, does it mean for future escalation, Professor, given the fact that things are so tense between the two sides already?
Well, we'll have to see what happens. I think underneath all of this is the threat of offensive operations about to begin on either the Ukrainian or the Russian side. And the Russians, have claimed from the beginning that the provision of American intelligence to Ukrainian forces is, in their minds, proof positive that the war isn't between Ukraine and Russia, it's between the United States or NATO and Russia. And so these drones are bringing in valuable intelligence that the Ukrainians can use for their offensive operations coming up here in the next few weeks or months. And I think you're going to see that the Russians are going to get more and more serious about trying to stop that.
And very briefly, the reaction from Moscow, what are you expecting there?
They'll deny that this was a deliberate attempt. They'll say that the drone, first of all, was not in international waters. And they'll say that their pilots were, flying professionally and just claim that certain things didn't happen, like the fuel jumping.
That was Professor Matthew Schmidt there from the University of New Haven speaking to me a little earlier. Well, time now to take a look at some of the other stories making headlines today, starting with